It's a real pleasure to welcome Melissa Reynolds to the Caring CEO. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Graham. Great to be here.
Melissa, what does care in the workplace mean to you?
It's a great question. When I think about care in the workplace, I think about it as being at the absolute centre of the organisation. And for me, it shows up in many ways. It really underpins the way in which you design and deliver services to your clients. It underpins teamwork. It underpins how we have reputation and our standing in the community. And it's absolutely central to the strategy and our priorities. So often I think care in the workplace gets considered as a soft skill and it's things that we feel. But I actually think that really care in the organisation gets demonstrated in many, many ways. It's about caring enough that you've got a mission that our organisation can align around. It gives meaning to the work that we do. It's about caring enough that our people know what the priorities are and where the company is going, that we've got processes in place and boundaries and clarity for people. So it's much more than a soft skill. I actually think care in the workplace is a strategic leadership strength, and it's very integrated into culture, meaning, strategy, purpose, and priorities.
Yeah, that's a wonderful description. And I read once that Theodore Roosevelt, once said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And it is that fundamental human need, isn't it, to feel that people around us want to support us, have each other's back, and have a sense of belonging. We can't change that. We're human. We really need that. You've had quite an interesting career, Melissa, in terms of the organisations you've worked with. And I read once, I don't know if this is true, but you started as a bank teller. Is that correct?
Oh, did indeed. A long time ago. Look, my career started when I was in high school, really. I worked in the paper shop that my mum and dad ran. And so my career has always been built around customer service. And I feel that even today, as the CEO, my job is still primarily in customer service, just in a very different way. So, my journey began when I finished school and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I think it was my dad that suggested getting a job in a bank was a good thing for a young girl to do. And he knew the local bank manager pretty well. So I got an interview and next couple of weeks I started, not quite as a teller. I had to be promoted to a teller, but I did a job which was a proof operator. In those days, all the checks used to come in. You used to have to read the checks. And of course, that job doesn't exist today. We've got machines that do it for us. But I spent probably the first 5 years of my career working as a teller in a bank. And I did my degree by night and I worked in the bank by day. So I ended up spending the next 15 years or so in banking in all sorts of roles. I moved to Sydney and I worked in head office and I ran the internal communications for the retail bank there. I worked as a product manager, designing everyday banking accounts. I was at the forefront in the 90s of technology when we were introducing telephone banking and later involved in the rollout of internet banking. So it goes to show how old I am. But I continued my study and I did a Master's of Commerce. And then I had the great opportunity to move to Western Australia, and I moved to Perth, and I was working on the integration of two banks at the time, and that was very exciting and very new, and it was also where I was appointed really into my first executive role as head of marketing for the newly merged entity. And then in 2000, I moved to Melbourne, so I have moved around a little bit, and I stayed a few more years in banking, and then around about 2006, my role was made redundant and I was pretty restless to do something different. And in fact, I had grown up in financial services and I felt probably in truth, I was probably a little bit bored with it at the time and I needed a change. And so as it turned out, I got a senior role with Census, White Pages. And that was absolutely fascinating. I stayed there for about 7 years. And it was actually just on the brink of digital search. So it was fascinating leading a paper-based organisation whose products were yellow and white pages and a huge transformation turning, that paper-based organization into digital. So it was also the time I stepped way outside of my comfort zone. I'd grown up in sort of product and marketing and communications roles, and it was the first time I moved into a sales leadership role and ran my first P&L. And, fantastic timing. It was in 2008, just at the GFC. And the first thing clients wanted to do was actually cut their advertising spend.
Wow.
So it was an incredible journey of resilience, actually, for our staff, because we had one of the most successful white pages businesses in the world. And then we had a workforce that suddenly went from feeling amazing to feeling, almost incompetent. And so it was an incredible journey of resilience in leading them at that point in time.
So what sort of things, sorry, I was just going to say, what sort of things did you do to address that, pain of uncertainty and disruption where it had been pretty plain sailing? What were some of the strategies you did to address that?
Well, I think the first thing was really around digging deep and having confidence in the products that we were selling and really having confidence in the proposition that we had. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, we did a lot more coaching with our leaders and provided a lot more support around them so that they could actually understand what they could control and what they couldn't control, and actually help our clients through what they were experiencing at the time as well, which was a high degree of uncertainty. Yeah. And so it was as much about, providing confidence to our clients as it was about providing confidence to our people.
Yeah.
But certainly it was not, it was not a time where you could stand back. And I think these experiences teach you how to really lean in and be very hands-on with your people and provide them, the support that they need.
Yeah, yeah. And what was your next move after that?
Well, after I spent a number of years at Census White Pages, I left and went back into banking and spent a few more years in banking. I ran the branch network for NAB. That was around 750 branches, and we had about 7,000 staff. And I think that was where you and I first worked together, Graham, when we were rolling out the moodometer, and we were also introducing the concepts around your one thing. So that was where we were going through a big change journey and recognizing the impact of that change on our people. You were able to come in and provide some fantastic skills for them at the time. So I left NAB to become the Chief Customer Officer at AGL. And then I had a career break just before COVID, actually, and bit of a hiatus during that period. And I think at that time, I sort of moved into thinking very deeply about what I wanted to do. And, that career break just before COVID turned into a slightly longer career break, because just before COVID, the executive market sort of dried up. And so I was in a situation where I was probably out of work for a little longer than I had anticipated. But at that time, I sort of changed directions and went down a professional director's path, and I was on the board of a number of organisations. And after a few years, really realised that I had missed terribly the executive role and the energy and the leadership. And so that brought me to State Trustees, and that brought me then to being the CEO of State Trustees. So, you can see that my career has had sort of lots of different twists and turns. And I often think that careers are a bit like snakes and ladders. They never always go up. But I think so long as you're continuously learning, you embrace new challenge, it's such an opportunity for both professional and personal growth.
Yeah, I was in executive search for a long time. I always were very interested in, the direction people went and why they chose certain roles. It tells you a lot. And, as you say, it's never a perfect path. There's always setbacks. There's always changes. That really happens a lot. But I think also it's not a lot of people go across as many industries as you have done. And I think each time you go across an industry, you're sort of outside your comfort zone. And, that's where you try new things. You might find something relevant in your past that is relevant in a new industry. Sometimes not, but it is a matter of trying. And it's really a reflection of today's marketplace, isn't it? Where nothing's 100% certain. We have our best prediction of what might work, but and it may work, but it's never guaranteed anymore. There's always things that aren't anticipated. It'd be great for people just to hear a little bit about state trustees and what you do in that organisation.
Yeah, thank you. Look, it's interesting. State Trustees is quite a unique organisation. We're a Victorian government-backed organisation, and we provide financial and legal services for people in moments of need. And so we really serve a very diverse client base. On one hand, we serve clients that are appointed to us because for reasons of mental health or illness or some other reason, they don't have the capacity to look after their financial affairs. And so we get appointed to do that for them and work with them. And so we deal with some of Victoria's most vulnerable clients who come with some very complex needs. And on the other hand, we provide agency for clients who are looking to get their affairs in good order for later in life when they might lose capacity, or for when they pass away. And so therefore we do wills, power of attorneys, we manage deceased estates, we do trusts, we have a charitable arm, and we also have a range of professional services, which includes legal and tax and investments. And so it's a very diverse set of services that we provide across a very, very diverse client base.
Yeah, yeah. And you spoke before about being really customer focused. How can you do that when there's so many different types of customers? Do the requirements differ or largely the same? What's been your
They're very different. It's a great question, and certainly one of the most wonderful things about working for this organisation is the incredible sense of passion and purpose that our people have. But one of the things that I really wanted to amplify when I came into the role as CEO was the voice of the client, and to really ensure that our client voices were at the centre of every decision that we made. And so some of the rituals that we have put in place include bringing a client story to every meeting. And so that's very much role modelled by the executive. We have a voice of client moment every week when we meet, and we hear the story of that client through, what's been happening for them. And sometimes it's a celebration of the work that we do, and sometimes it actually enables us to go, well, how could we have done better? Has, all parts of the organisation been working together for the benefit of this client? So really amplifying the voices of our client in everything that we do. The other thing I did was put in place a mandatory culture goal for every employee in the organisation. And that was to spend time in another business unit or another team and see the client's experience from a different perspective. And the reason for that is that delivering a client outcome is not something that one person can do, and it requires everybody to link arms, to come together. It's very interdependent, and we can only do that if we actually can see that experience through somebody else's eyes. And so ensuring that each of our team members, even if they're in a client-facing role, spends time in another team and really understanding the client experience from a different perspective. So every one of our clients is different, but it's a way in which we demonstrate care for our employees because they, it brings a collective sense of belonging and purpose. And only through that, then, can you really deliver that very human-centric client service for the many types of individuals that we serve.
Yeah. With that, voice of client, how does it actually happen? Does one person present an avatar, or how does it occur? How do you?
Well, yeah, so sometimes it's just simply a story. So, for example, we had, and they're told through our consultants. We changed the name of the client so that it's anonymized and private. But, it could be an example like this. Last week at our executive team, the story that came forward was a story about a client whose name was Brenda. We had just moved Brenda, who's about 97, from her home and into aged care. And she was really missing her garden and her flowers. And so we called the aged care facility that she had just been placed in, and we said, look, is there anything that we can do to help make Brenda's life happier? And they told us that she had really missed her flowers and her gardens, but she's also quite bedridden, so she can't get up and sort of move around. So we said, well, what if we were to send her flowers every week? And so every week in the aged care home, Brenda gets a beautiful bouquet of flowers, and it's something that she looks forward to and brings a real sort of twinkle and spark to her face. So that story was a very simple one. It was told through our consultant. And when we reflect on that, we go, well, that's more than just doing your job. And that is, you know, moving the person from one location to the other as our requirements. But it's going that extra step. It's actually understanding what would make a difference for Brenda in her life at this point in time.
Yeah.
And so it's stories like those. Sometimes it'll be a story that we get through a client complaint that we unpack and say, well, how could we have done that differently? Where did the system fall down and what could we have done differently? So they take very, very different expressions, but mostly they are stories that our people put forward because they're really proud of the difference that they've made.
Yeah, I love that. With this role, it's obviously quite different to working at a bank or AGL or census. How did it strike you when you started? What did you notice about the culture?
One of the things that I was reflecting on when I sort of took a career break was I've always been somebody who was driven by, one, learning, and two, a deep sense of purpose. And having spent all of my career in really big organizations and major brands, I think I got to the point where I was really looking for an organization that was very deeply centered in purpose.
Yeah.
And it is one of the things that I love most about my role, and that is the purpose of the organization. And what struck me about the culture here was that really deep sense of purpose and care that all of our staff bring to work every single day. And therefore, you know, amplifying that, bringing it to life has been a real joy.
Yeah.
But it's certainly very unique, not only in what we do, but how we go about doing it, and very, very different culturally from most major corporations. And I think, you know, as you go through your career, you look for different things at different times. And this was certainly the time in my career where I wanted to take all the skills and experience that I had learned in some really complex settings and bring them to an organization that was really deeply human-centered and purpose-driven.
Yeah. I noticed there's a bit of a common theme across a number of your roles, and that's about digital transformation and, you know, changing from, I guess, the slower, more hands-on to, you know, the more digital, the more apps, the more everything. When you manage that process, and you have for a number of occasions, how do you keep in mind the role of people who may not be needed when the transformation is completed?
I think it's about, I mean, when you think about any change, whether it's a digital transformation or anything, organizations are, you know, they're living things. They need to continue to change in order to survive. And so if I think about whether it's banking or energy or even the way that we deliver services today at State Trustees, there is always going to be change. And it's really important for our leaders to understand why the change is occurring and how that change relates to a better outcome for a client and how it's going to make the organisation better in the long run. And so there are always going to be a personal impact, but in that is also opportunity, because it means people have got the chance to learn new skills or do new things or have their own career opportunities. And so, ensuring that we've got leaders who understand the why of the change, who understand the impact of the change, and who have the skills to not only embrace the change themselves, but to lead others through it is a really critical component of any successful transformation.
Yeah.
There is always a people impact. And so that's where I think things like setting up well-being, transparency and assistance for people in terms of how they transition through that change becomes really important to the change being embraced.
Yeah. Yeah. And with, that change, there's obviously a toll that it plays on you as well. What do you do to practice self-care? What keeps you in the green zone on the moodometer?
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of things which I've practiced throughout my life. I mean, firstly, very physically, the thing I love to do is work out with weights. I try and move every day. I love the outdoors. I stretch. I try and get a good night's sleep. I eat well. So taking care of my physical self is a very important part of my self-care strategy. Mentally, I try and unplug every night. And probably late last year, I actually bought a sauna. And so that's my new place to unplug in 65-degree heat. And so 30 minutes in that a day or every second day is a fabulous way to unwind. I can meditate, I can listen to a podcast, I can journal if I feel up to it, and I get away from it all. So it's my own little box, literally, but it's just a wonderful mental break for me. The other thing I try and do probably a couple of times a year if I can is go on a retreat where I am completely a nobody. I'm not a mum, I'm not a wife, I'm not a CEO, I'm nobody. And I can just sort of unravel and rebuild. And I find that a really nourishing thing to do. So there's a number of things that I tend to try and do to self-care. There's probably a few, I'm quite a spiritual person, so I'm very much guided by my faith, and I love, prayer and meditation. My family and my friends are a great support to me, and I get a lot of nourishment from them. But I find one of the other self-care techniques is actually about having something to look forward to every day. And sometimes for me, that's as simple as my morning coffee. Sometimes it's just as simple as looking forward to Saturday night and sitting on the couch with the kids and watching a movie. And sometimes there's a bigger thing to look forward to, like, a family holiday or something. So I find if you can have something to look forward to every day, that's a really important part of self-care as well.
Yeah, it's a very holistic approach that you're taking there, which is sensational. And looking forward, they say that actually looking forward to something great is even bigger than the actual event, but that makes it all the more better, doesn't it? It makes it such incredibly important to look forward to. My wife and I are planning to walk around Mont Blanc in August, and we're preparing our walking now, but we're also watching videos on YouTube about walking around, and so we're experiencing it already, not the blood, sweat and tears yet, but the amazing sights along the way.
Oh, it'll be beautiful.
It will be.
I think the other thing we do is we practice gratitude. And so, my family has a ritual where every night when we have dinner together, we just have a moment of gratitude, and everybody who's at the table says something that they're grateful for. And look, sometimes that's as pedestrian as, hey, I'm grateful for my dog. When my daughter was little, it used to be almost like the whole ecosystem. I'm grateful for the rain that, watered the plants, that, made the food that's now on my table. So like dinner was cold by the time we got through hers. But it's a really important practice. And in fact, it's something that we do at our executive team every week as well, is we just go around the room, we say, look, what are we grateful for? I mean, lots of teams will celebrate their wins for the week, and we do that too. But gratitude actually opens up and puts you in a very different space. You call it the green zone. I agree with that. And it's incredible just what our people will say about gratitude, what they're grateful for, not only from a work point of view, but actually what they're grateful for in their lives. It's a beautiful practice.
Yeah, it really is. Well proven to make a difference. And we humans have a negativity bias. And so we naturally think of the things that go wrong unless we have a deliberate prompt like you're describing to recognize what's going right. Across your group, you're servicing some very disadvantaged people. And how do you, I guess, you've talked a number of occasions about building that purpose, but how do you also build psychological safety where people do feel free to make suggestions on how things could be improved? They can challenge ideas they don't think make sense, and they can offer ideas and, be heard. How do you do that across an organization?
There are two parts to that, and I find employees wanting to suggest new ideas is quite different to wanting to raise problems and concerns. And so for new ideas, we encourage people to sort of think about better ways of doing things, and we have a Bright Ideas initiative where anyone can contribute an idea. They sort of pitch it a bit like Shark Tank to a panel. And, subject to that being all sort of sorted, then it can move into pilot and implementation. So we've got a really nice and fun way of being able to create, energy around new ideas. But when it's around raising concerns and problems, I think it is a bit different, and it can often be a bit scarier for people. So how do we go about creating sort of psychological safety? Well, when I first came into the CEO role, I went out and visited with all of our people and all of our sites, and I really wanted to hear honestly what was working and what was not working. And I shared them a story about the cornflake. And what I described was, the hardest job in the organization is being the CEO. And the reason for that is people think that you only want the good news stories. And so if you think about what a cornflake is, it's a pretty nondescript, sort of not particularly interesting flake of corn, and it comes in a cardboard box. And so often problems will start out like a cornflake, but by the time they go through the layers of the management team and up the hierarchy and finally up to the CEO, they've been so sugar-coated and so sugar-coated and so sugar-coated that the cornflake looks nothing like a cornflake. It resembles more a Fruit Loop. And so I said to the team, I want us to deal with cornflakes. If I don't know the cornflakes, I can't help because I don't know that there's a problem. And I think that just provided a language and an environment where I was, opening up quite candidly my appetite to hear what wasn't working as well. So we are really trying to build a culture where it is safe for people to speak up. And I think that starts with leadership. It's about, being candid when things are not working, not without accountability, but certainly without blame. And even when things are not going as well as what they could be, it's being open and honest about that and helping our people understand through uncertain times what's ahead of them with some degree of certainty. So, there's a number of things that we do. I do skip level meetings with all of my direct reports. And so across the entire year, I meet with all of our senior leaders one-on-one. And when I'm out and about meeting with all of the various people across the organisation, I meet with them team by team by team by team. And so that's a real opportunity for my learning. I call them sort of CEO learning sessions. And once again, in those small groups, it creates a really safe environment for people to tell me about what's going on in their team, what's going on for them. And I get tremendous value out of those sessions. I learn a lot, and then I can go and put in place things that might be helpful to them. So there's a whole range of different things that we do in order to create a safe to speak up culture. But it's always a work in progress. These are often difficult conversations, removing stigma, creating a sense where there's no judgment, just active listening, all of those sorts of things are practices that actually help make it safe for employees to say what's on their mind.
Yeah. I remember you once telling me that you did a counselling course, and be interested to know a little bit about that and why you chose to do that.
Yeah, look, I think it was one of those things that, again, sort of post or just coming out of COVID, and when I was going through some changes in my life around career, and I had witnessed, particularly through that whole COVID period, so many people in my circle going through difficult times, broken relationships or death, grief, loss. And I was also dealing with my own stuff. And so I wanted to be better skilled and equipped to be able to manage my own sort of situation, my own pain. But I also really wanted to be better supporting other people. And so all of my education had been, I did a Bachelor of Economics, I did a Master's of Commerce, I did an advanced management program at INSEAD in France. And a lot of that is around leadership and strategy and business. And so doing the counselling course was something purely for self-interest. And at its basis, it's around empathy, active listening, and being non-judgmental. So I found that these skills have been incredibly important in the work that I do and in leadership. So all of these sorts of things are very essential, I think, in terms of being a caring CEO. So applying the counselling basics in the workplace has meant really taking a person-centred leadership approach. And so I would practice and use those skills every single day in my work and in my home. And I think, again, just the principles of counselling, it promotes psychological safety, because when leaders can listen without judgment, then employees are more likely to speak up. It also helps support mental health and well-being, because as a CEO, I'm very aware of the mental health issues and the impacts that they have on our people when it comes to things like stress and burnout and life balance and so forth. So whilst I don't think CEOs need to be counsellors, for me, adopting the core principles of counselling has, definitely helped in terms of team dynamics and trying to create a more human workplace. It's just been one of the things I've loved doing, and I'll continue to do, sort of add-on subjects. So I've got a couple of extra things I'm doing and majoring in, in the years to come. So, yeah.
Great stuff. One of the previous people I've interviewed is Bob Chapman, and he runs a very successful company in the US called Barry Wymiller. He's the author of a book called Everybody Matters, and he just really reinforces what you've just talked about. And he said, when he first started his journey, he thought you showed you care by doing stuff. You have to do stuff. And then he finally realized that you show you care by listening with empathy. And, we all have a desire to be heard, don't we?
Absolutely right. And I think, I think sometimes earlier in our careers, we can be so busy getting to where we want to go that we do a lot of doing and we don't be a lot of being.
Yeah.
And I think that is a natural sort of maturity that occurs, but there's so much more awareness around the need to be heard and seen than I think there were, even 20 or 30 years ago.
It's ironical, isn't it? Because with social media, we're supposed to be better connected and better heard, but it doesn't happen, or it maybe was at first, but it certainly hasn't turned out that way. We can't rely on it, that's for sure. It's been an absolute pleasure catching up, Melissa. We were reflecting before we came on air that it was about 10 years ago that I worked with all your bank managers at NAB around the country, building their personal and team resilience. It was a wonderful experience doing that. And at that same time, we had both, through just coincidence, just completed the Kokoda track together.
We had. Wow, that was an amazing experience, that's for sure. Talk about resilience.
Yeah, it was very, very, very humbling. And I had the pleasure of taking my son on the track, and he was about 20, I think, at the time. So he was the age of those young soldiers there. And I just really realized what a massive sacrifice they made unbelievable. When you get to that symmetry at the end, it really, really brings it home, doesn't it?
Oh, it certainly does. And look, for me, I was never into a lot of the Australian history, so I learned a lot in going over to Kokoda. And of course, there's the physical challenge. It's so hard and it takes such perseverance to complete it. What surprised me was my own reaction and how sentimental I became. And it's, just moments where you realize the sacrifices that others have made for peace. It was an incredible experience, one that will always stay with me. I don't have a desire to do it again, but it was one of those really, really special things that I had the great fortune of being able to do.
Yeah. And we both agree we don't want to do it again.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, I'd rather be hiking somewhere else. You'll find me anytime where I'm not working. I'm very happy to be hiking the hills somewhere else, but I'd much prefer an alpine location than back in the depths of the jungle again, that's for sure.
I always finish with the same question, Melissa. Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give? I guess that first role you had, when you first entered the bank, what advice would you give that person?
Well, it's funny you ask that because I've got a 20-year-old daughter at the moment who is just doing an overseas exchange, and I wrote her a letter as she was getting on the plane, and it was almost like, giving advice back to my younger self. But there's probably three things I would say. Is first of all, you don't need to have it all planned out. Careers will unfold and new opportunities will present themselves. Just be yourself, be true to yourself, and always keep learning.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful lessons. Thanks so much for being part of the Caring CEO, Melissa. It's been wonderful connecting with you again.
It's been a pleasure to be with you today, Graham, and all the very best.